Colin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. When I first came across your book, I don't know, 8 years ago or so, I would have never ever thought that you and I would be talking here today. Um, Many years ago, I posted on LinkedIn how I really think that urban design makes a difference on our lives. And I'm not from the field of architecture. In fact, my primary background is emerging tech and national security. But having lived around the world, I wanted the world to know this. I put it on LinkedIn. I said, "Hey, I think there's something here." And somebody in my network responded and said, "You really need to read Places of the Heart," and couldn't recommend it more highly. So I immediately bought it. And I read it and I loved all of it because it resonated with how I felt living in three continents, multiple countries, that the way a city is designed impacts your life, impacts how you feel, but even about yourself, how you feel about yourself. And knowing that you have done research, which you're going to show us, about how our bodies respond, and you've done the actual technical part of measuring our skin conductance and all of that. And I can't wait to see what you have come up with. But first, I would love it if you could introduce yourself, and then we'll continue.
Sure, sounds good. I guess my official designation would be that I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I have a lab at the University of Waterloo in Canada that we've called the Urban Realities Laboratory. And I'll tell you the reason that we called it that is because in my lab many years ago we had a competition to rename the lab from something much more cumbersome. And one of my grad students said, why don't we call it the Urban Realities Lab? Because then the abbreviation will be URL. And
Oh,
who's going to forget the URL? So that's what we've called ourselves. But it reflects what we do. I think as I show you some of the things that we've done, you'll get the sense for the kind of work that I've done. But it's all basically at the interface between cognitive science, neuroscience, and architectural and urban design. So we've tried to work at a range of scales from the insides of rooms to urban scale. I think everything I brought to show you today is at urban scale, but I'm happy to talk about anything else as well. And we use a variety of different kinds of technologies. And I'll show you a bit of both of the main approaches that we've used. One of them is to do field work, which is something that when I got into it, I felt hadn't really been done enough. The argument from me was basically that if you can only show an effect in a pristine laboratory setting, then how do you know that the same kinds of things happen in the real world? So we undertook to try to measure people's minds and bodies in real world settings in, as you'll see in this case, urban environments. But you can't do everything in the field. So we've also tried to use virtual reality,
mhm.
um, which these days, I mean, it's kind of old hat. A lot of people have immersive VR headsets in their homes. When we started to do it, I don't know what, 15 years ago or more, it was kind of um, more expensive for sure, and less common. So we thought we were pretty cool, but designing this VR lab to study these kinds of problems. And I'll show you a little bit of the research that we've done with that as well.
Mhm.
I don't know, is this still introduction or am I not? What am I doing now, Lydia?
You're going to the next slide.
I'm just going to the
You're
next.
just
Thank
going
you
to the
for
next slide.
the prompt. Here we are. So I like to tell this story, and if I'm getting off track or not slipping into relevancy, then just pull me up.
Okay.
But I like to start with a story about Stonehenge because I really feel as though this was, although I didn't realize it at the time when I was, I don't know, 5, 6 years. I think I was 6 years old. Um,
Mhm.
when my father brought me to Stonehenge a long time ago when it didn't look as it does now in the sense that if you go now, there are fences and guide rails and there's a snack bar and there's a souvenir shop and I remember it as being just me and my dad and the Stones
Mhm.
and Bearfield. And my dad was in the building trades. He was a quantity surveyor, so he was very interested in materials, and a lot of it had to do with costs, but he was also intrinsically interested in how stuff got built.
Hmm.
But I like to think that he also had a sensibility for what, for me, has become the most important aspect of understanding built design, and that is its emotional impact. So I still remember standing on this field, walking up to and touching these stones and feeling as though I was in the presence of something really almost beyond my comprehension in terms of its power and its impact. And I like to think that my dad felt kind of a bit of the same way about it. And so that I didn't think about this until I think after I started to write the book that you referred to so kindly, Lydia, that, you know, and we had a conversation pre-beginning of recording about the impact of our early lives and parents, etc. And I like to think that my dad may have done this to me, for which I thank him. Um, so this is moving to something else that's actually this is a lot older than Stonehenge. This is the unearthed remains of a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe that a colleague put me onto many years ago, and connected me with one of the archaeologists who's working on the site now. Not the person who discovered the site, unfortunately, he's passed, but the Göbekli Tepe is much much older than Stonehenge. I think if it's a I think it's about twice as old as Stonehenge, and
Hmm.
it interested me because it's one of the very first examples that we have of a built setting for one of the first things that humans built of any kind of stature. Um,
And what was it for? Do you know?
this is the key question. So we don't know. We don't know what it was for. We know that nobody lived there.
Hmm.
Um, one suspects that it was maybe a place of sanctuary, maybe a place of ritual, maybe a
Mm.
healing place.
Mm.
There's evidence that there were meals cooked there,
Hmm.
but there's no evidence of long-term habitation.
Mm.
And this is just, as you can see, it's kind of a cheesy visualization of what it might have been like to build Göbekli Tepe. The most important point here is that it would have taken a lot of people coming together to build something like this at a time in our history when lots of people typically didn't come together for anything. People lived in small groups of about 100 people.
Mm.
And it would have taken more than that. It would have taken a gathering of lots of people to put this together.
Mm.
So whatever it was for was considered important enough to do things that ordinarily were not done. And so Klaus Schmidt, who was the person in modern times who discovered this site, said famously this, that first came the temple and then the city. And what he meant by that is that when we think about things like urban design, when we think about cities and what they're for and where they came from, we think mostly of the kinds of things that happen to people when we gather in large groups. Well, we have to have maybe defenses, we have to have places to store our stuff, we have to have ways of protecting our livelihoods. And Schmidt said that was all afterwards. He said the first built designs, including Göbekli Tepe, were more for the ritual. Think of them as spiritual occasions of our lives. In other words, they had to do with our emotional lives rather than to do with the pragmatics of putting together a life. And I really like that idea. I mean, it's an obvious thing for me to like, given the kind of scientist that I am. But I really like the fact that Schmidt and his co-workers put together this idea that emotions were paramount in the very origins of built design.
I would also add that perhaps the temple is also a bit of the third space, which we talk about today. It's not your home, it's not your work. And if back then they didn't really have like suburbia and the downtown district, that the temple was really their main third space where they would gather with others.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and it's such a long time ago, it's hard to know many aspects of what life would have been like for people. We know or at least we're pretty sure we know that people lived mostly in kin groups. And this is
Mhm.
an important point that I'm going to come to in a
Hmm.
couple of slides. But we don't know, like, there must have been interactions between kin groups.
Hmm.
And those interactions, maybe you're right, Lydia, would have been um, well served by a third space like something like Göbekli Tepe,
Hmm.
a long time ago. Okay, so I'd like to talk a bit about this. Dunbar's number, for better or for worse, is an idea that was popularized following the work of a primatologist named Robin Dunbar, who was interested in monkeys and apes, and he was interested in neuroanatomy and also in behavior. And he put together this graph, as you can see, some years ago, where basically what he's showing here is a relationship between a brain value. If you look on the horizontal axis, you see size of neocortex, so that's the outer mantle of the brain, where we tend to think that all of the hard thinking cognitive stuff goes on. And on the vertical axis, you can see average social group size. And what Dunbar argued was that as group size increases, you can almost think of it as like a cognitive tax. You can think of this exerting pressure on an animal to have enough brain processing power to be able to do the things that you need to do to live successfully in a group. And the bigger the group, the more complicated that becomes. The more there is to attend, the
Mhm.
more there is to remember.
Mhm.
It's really important to remember who's who, to understand social hierarchies, to notice what's going on, and to process all of that social information to succeed. So, I always like to put up a picture of a brain somewhere in a talk, and make the silly point that if you show a picture of a brain, whatever you say next, people believe. And that's beyond a joke. There's actually empirical evidence for this that, people who do brain imaging, for example, know that if you put up an imaging slide, then whatever you say next is going to be believed, sometimes no matter how preposterous it might be.
Okay, so you're intentionally putting that brain picture there.
I am, absolutely, yes.
Noted.
Now believe this. Look where humans are on this graph. Um, we know anatomy. So we know how big their neocortex is, our neocortex is relative to the rest of the brain. And now if you follow that horizontal dotted line, you see what kind of average social group size we can cope with. And you see the number comes out to about 150, 120 to 100, 150 people. So what that means is that if you believe Dunbar, then once you get beyond about 150 people, you don't have the brain processing power to be able to do the things socially that you need to do. So,
Such as, for example, what do you mean socially?
I mean, being able to keep track, being able to remember enough about the people that you know
Hmm.
to be able to deal with them successfully, to
Hmm.
interact with them, to understand them. The problems become too complicated for us
Got it.
to process. So this leads to the obvious point. Jane Jacobs, noted urbanist, had a way of saying something pithy to capture something really important about human life in cities. And in this case, she just said cities are by definition full of strangers, which seems obvious. When we live in a big city, we don't know most of the people that we live with. We're in
Right.
close quarters with a lot of strangers. And so, given that, and given Dunbar, I've always liked to think of urban design as being a kind of cognitive prosthesis. What I mean by that is that the way that we design a city allows us to cope with living circumstances that far outstrip our capabilities based on our neuroanatomy. So we can do the things that we do only within the protective realm of good urban design.
Hmm.
Counter to that, poor urban design can really wreak some havoc with us.
Mhm.
Um, So, and I already talked a bit about this. Here's the boilerplate shot of my lab filled with, as you can see on the left, happy people and on it doing VR studies, and on the right you can see a little snippet of a field study that we did, one of many. This was in Mumbai. We had people stand in sort of towards the edge, but in a traffic circle in Mumbai, which is an interesting thing to ask people to do. And we
Yeah.
measured the states of their bodies while doing it, and we asked them questions.
Okay.
Okay, so a lot of what I'll talk about in terms of the science that I've done has to do with the skins of buildings, building facades. So here's this is a building facade. I think this is Toronto, where we did some of this work. You can see that it's interestingly varied. Every building is a little bit different. There's a lot
Mhm.
of stuff going on. Um, some of the facades are a little bit dilapidated, but nevertheless, there's a lot to look at here. There's a lot to capture your attention.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we've many years ago, I mean, um, in the interest of time, I'll try to keep the story of all of this short, but the short
Mhm.
version is that we were commissioned by a a major, what would you call it? An exhibition, I suppose, that was designed by the Guggenheim Museum in New York and funded by BMW of all
Mhm.
corporations. And the idea was to set up kind of a traveling think tank to study problems of urbanism. And they called this the BMW Guggenheim Laboratory. And by some incredible stroke of luck, somebody said, if we're calling this a laboratory, we really need to do an experiment. And if we want to do an experiment, let's call Colin and see if he's interested. So that's how I started studying building facades. We had the idea of using some simple technology. You can see one example. There's a million different ways to do this, but this is how these days we measure skin conductance. So you can see a couple of straps on two adjacent fingers on this person's hand, connected to wires that lead to a box that you wear on the wrist that it can talk to a cell phone, or it can just collect data all by itself. And what it does is measures the electrical conductance between those two fingers. It's not something that you can feel happening. The amount of electricity that we pass through people's fingers is minute. It's
Mhm.
about, I think it's 10,000th of what you'd feel if you got a static shock after shuffling across a carpet. So
Mhm.
it's beyond, it's beneath sensation, but the value of it is that it gives us a nice little window into the state of people's autonomic nervous system. So think of the part of your nervous system that people often first think of something like fight or flight responses, but there's more to it than that. The underlying state of that part of your nervous system tells us about your state of physiological arousal. And it's pretty easy to measure even in somebody who's just walking around in the streets of a city.
Quick
So
question.
just
Why did you do it on the index finger and the middle finger? Does it matter?
Yeah, you can do it anywhere that you have what's called glabrous skin. So the hairless skin that has lots of
Got
sweat
it.
glands basically. But we've done it on the wrist is not so great. The palm of the hand is really good. We never did this, but some years ago we got interested in using people's feet. Long story as to why we'd want to do that, but I mean. The autonomic nervous system is everywhere. So anywhere you can pick up sweat gland activity is would work well.
Mm,
Figures are really good.
good. Thanks.
Sure. So here's an overhead shot of an intersection in Lower Manhattan in New York City. This was the first place, the original site of the BMW Guggenheim Lab was around here. And just as kind of a proof of principle, for one of our experiments, we had people cross you can see it's a major street, East Houston Street.
Hmm.
When it's busy, there's lots of traffic, obviously. There's buses, there are taxi cabs, there are people turning. So
Mm.
for a pedestrian walking across the street, it's a bit of a thing. And we just measured, this wasn't initially even part of an experiment. We just measured, I'll go to the next slide. we just measured people's skin conductance as they walked across the street, and this is just a quick sample of one, two, three different people crossing the street.
Hmm.
Those squiggly lines represent arousal levels as measured by skin conductance, and you can see, not all that surprisingly, that they tend to go up when people are walking across the street. The green arrow is where they stepped off the curb. Um, so it's telling us that these measures are telling us something about people's state of arousal in an urban environment.
And you said
This,
this is three people. Those each line, the pink line is one person, the purple line is another person. Is that correct?
that's right. That's right.
So I
Yeah.
have a question for you.
Yeah.
These are three different individuals represented by three different lines that are showing three different stories. Yes, you can see that there's a bit of a peak for each one of them around the same time. Do you have any kind of extra data to know why the purple person only blimped up a little bit versus the pink person a lot?
No, no, we don't. But of course, that's a really interesting question. I guess the one caveat to mention is that the differences that you see there not be might be exaggerating what's happening in this situation, because part of the reason why you would get a particular squiggly line for a particular person has to do with the local conditions of the sensors or electrodes on the fingers.
Hmm.
So there would be differences just in exactly where the sensor head is sitting. There would be differences perhaps even in things like the size of the person, the thickness of the fingers, all kinds of stuff that maybe would be less interesting than I think what you're asking about, Lydia. Um,
My thought was perhaps that maybe the purple person is used to doing that kind of
yep,
stressful thing, and the pink person perhaps that is not as used to doing that.
absolutely. Could be the case, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. We didn't look, but
Hmm.
um, yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, so this is now if you look at those blue contours, they represent the average arousal levels of, I think in this case it was 10 people walking through the city. And the
Hmm.
point of this is just to show that as you walk through any kind of urban space, that level of arousal rises and falls, and it's systematic. I mean,
Hmm.
the triggers for those changes are things that are happening in your environment. So when you see that big high curtain at the very top of the illustration, that's when people are walking along. Again, that's East Houston Street. It's a big, busy, noisy street. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, so people were walking this way,
Hmm.
um, and then into this is a community garden down here. So you can see that when they're in the garden,
Hmm.
arousal levels go low, as you would
Hmm.
expect. And then when they
Hmm.
leave the garden and come out to the rest of the city, eventually back here to this is Allen Street to East Houston Street,
Hmm.
arousal levels go up again. All of this is to say that, of course, it's this is not happening because we're measuring. This is how we are. This is when we're walking through, when we're pedestrians in an urban space, arousal levels rise, arousal levels fall, and there are reasons for that that have to do with our surroundings.
Hmm.
And presumably, and I'll get into this a bit more, presumably those reasons are important in terms of understanding the impact of a city and its building facades on people's physiological state and even
Hmm.
their state of health.
Hmm.
So to to try to study that more systematically, what we started to do in New York and then carried on, we've been had a minor obsession with doing this in a number of different cities throughout the world, and the story is always basically the same.
Hmm.
We tried to find sites. We keyed into complexity. So we wanted to ask questions about, however you might want to define it, how the complexity of a site influences um, people's physiological state. So we looked for locations of low complexity. This is an example. This is in Berlin. This is a restaurant in Berlin. that you can see has about the blankest facade that it's possible to imagine a
That's
building.
very Berlin.
Yeah, isn't it? Isn't it? Yeah. I never went into this restaurant, but I thought, what, and I don't know what the story was, but what would anyway, it's a tangent. What would possess somebody to do a facade like that? But Berlin, yes. This is actually a fairly not quite as blank as the Berlin facade, but this is in Canada. This is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Also, not super complex or interesting facade. This is where is this? This is South America, Brazil. Um, I'm blocking on the name of the city, which is stupid because it's a major city. But anyway, you can see it's a very interesting, lively building facade. Lots of things going on there, and not just the skin of the building. Other things, not really by coincidence, happening in front of that facade as well. This
Something
is
that, sorry, also
yeah,
in the previous one, the building, if you take out the artistic part on top of it, it is actually a boring building.
it
And
is.
so, which also actually creates a beautiful canvas because it's just like basically flat.
Yeah,
And that is something that I think that in some places they've started to see that you could take a flat, boring building, make it really pretty, and then all of a sudden people start to congregate. Would they have congregated if an artist didn't come and do that?
yeah. It's a good question. I would say no. I would say they wouldn't. I think that addition of complexity to that site um, gathers people. I mean, it's I suppose you'd call it public art. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
murals.
really nice evidence that public art has all kinds of even fairly simple stuff and not that hard to do. Public art has a significant effect on people's attraction to a site, how they feel when they're there, how they feel about one another when they enjoy that site together. So yeah, I think it's all kind of in the mix.
Hmm.
And an important point is probably that it's not really all that hard to do.
No, it's not.
This is sorry, did you have another?
No, I just said no, it's not as hard to do.
Okay. This is Berlin. The lighting in this photograph is not the greatest, so it looks maybe less attractive than it actually is when you're there. But this is an example again of a
Mhm.
highly complex site that we chose for one of the field studies that we did in uh, in that. I'm distracted because I never noticed before that little graphic that says "No pain, no brain."
Where does it say that?
Top left.
Up.
Almost see that little. Can you see it?
Yes, I see it now with the red and white.
No pain, no brain.
That
Huh.
must be the name of the store.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is.
We'll
It's
have
a
to look
good
that one
name.
up.
Yeah. And again, this is back to Canada. So this is. There's not much going on in the street. I think it was an early morning in. I think it was November, so it
Hmm.
would have been a bit snappy, but interesting contrasts in the facades and arguably a high level of complexity. So back in the day, this graphic comes from the very first time that we tried to look at the impact of not just complexity, but a number of different things in the city. You can see a map. That map shows the route that we had people walk. We took them for a walk of about an hour in length. They carried cell phones that were programmed to ask them a series of questions along the way, and they also wore those sensors that I described to you. And you can see a bunch of thumbnails on the right side of the slide that shows you some of the sites or shows you really all of the sites where we stop people to probe their minds and their bodies.
Hmm.
Um, this is just cutting to the chase. This is a summary of the findings from those sites, especially comparing high and low complexity sites. Um, the bottom line here is that how to read this. So the numbers in the bars represent levels of physiological arousal from skin conductance. So, and they're all measured relative to baseline, the baseline being where people started at the lab site, where we started the walk.
Hmm.
And so the difference here shows that when people are standing in front of high complexity sites, they tend to show increases in arousal relative to baseline. And when they stand in front of low complexity sites, they show low arousal relative to baseline. Now, that all by itself doesn't tell us everything that we'd like to know, because if you think back to what I showed you a few slides ago, I told you that when people are standing in a nice lush community garden in the city, their arousal levels go low. And so the difference here is that when you ask people about how they feel at the site, people standing in front of low complexity sites tend to report negative affect, negative emotional states.
Such as, for example, what negative emotional states?
Well, we used a variety of different kinds of questions, ranging from people just giving us on a scale of 1 to 7 how happy they felt, to somewhat more nuanced questions like trying to probe their attraction to the site,
Mm-hmm.
whether they wanted to approach the site or leave the site.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Honestly, without even asking people questions, without even talking to people, you can see this in effect in the streets, because if you look at people's, even their posture, their walking speed, people gun past low complexity sites quite quickly
Mm-hmm.
and linger at high complexity sites.
Mm-hmm.
So it was this combination that really interested me, this combination of low arousal and low affect, because I have a colleague at the University of Waterloo. His name is James Dankert. He literally wrote the book on boredom. He's written a lovely book called Out of My Skull. And in one of the studies that he cites in that book, a study done by him and his graduate student, Colleen Merrifield, they showed that when people are put into boring situations, and this was a lab-based study, they show low physiological arousal, they show low affect, and most interestingly to me, they show increases in secretion of cortisol, the stress hormone.
Hmm.
So when people are presented with situations that show low affect and low arousal, that's the absolute signature of boredom. And boredom, James argues, and many agree with him, can be bad for you, can be bad for your body. So I kind of parlayed all of that
Quick
into,
question. How can
yeah,
boredom be bad for the body? What does bad for the body mean?
bad for the body means that boredom is actually stressful. Boredom can be a stressful event, and like all kinds of uncontrollable stress, it can have knock-on effects. And there's a really well-established set of links between increases in boredom and increased cortisol responses and metabolic disorders, cardiac disorders, self-harming, addictive behaviors. All of these things are linked to boredom. Even, I think there's 1 or 2 studies even suggesting that being subjected to chronic boredom can actually shorten your lifespan. So all of that together suggested to me that there was a way of thinking about what was happening when we built boring building facades, to suggest that this was actually a matter of public health. That it's not as if to say that walking past a boring bank headquarters, or in the original study that we did in New York, we used a Whole Food store
Mhm.
as the example of a boring blank facade. It's not as if walking past that is going to cause a stroke or a heart attack. But if you think about being surrounded by those kinds of contexts, day after day, week after week, year after year of your life, it's not unreasonable to think that that is going to have a cumulative effect on your state of health. No different to, on the positive side of things, the evidence that suggests that people living in circumstances where they have abundant access to green space has a positive effect. This is maybe the other side of the coin.
Well, with green spaces, there's more to that because green spaces also offer oxygen, cleaner air, etc. But when it comes to boredom, I like how the way you have discussed it, where the facades themselves create an effect of stress. And this stress you have been able to document it through electrical conductance to show that the autonomic system is responding in an adverse way. And then you're saying that there's a domino effect, that if this were to be your steady state, that over time it could then develop into other problems for the body.
Yep,
Okay.
that's exactly right. That's what I'm arguing.
Okay. Thanks.
So that was you might have noticed the date on that original study was 2011. We did a number of other studies
Mhm.
of the same kind in different places over the years, but it was only quite recently that the architect Thomas Heatherwick published a book called Human Eyes and embarked on a 10-year campaign to stamp out. I think I've got an image here from, yeah, boring buildings starve our soul, destroy our planet, et cetera, et cetera. So a thoroughgoing campaign to both understand and advocate for a different kind of architecture, a different way of thinking about not just the exteriors of buildings, but buildings as a whole and their psychological impact. So the Heatherwick Studio commissioned another study from us where we basically did the same things that I just showed you. So I won't dwell on this, but we were able to, with the advantage of improvements in technology, improvements in
Hmm.
our understanding of what we were doing, do the same kind of thing again. We
Hmm.
did some studies in these images are from the London part of the study. We did a similar study in Toronto. We were more thoughtful about how we define complexity.
Hmm.
So if you I didn't show you much. I showed you a few images of low and high complexity settings,
Hmm.
but in the original experiments, we were defining that kind of casually. It was basically uh, me and other people on the team walking around to sites and saying, "Yeah, this looks really low complex, has a low value of complexity. This one has higher complexity," but we didn't actually, in complete honesty, measure anything.
Hmm.
It was much more casual than that. The
Hmm.
early experiments for BMW Goog were almost, think of them as demo mode experiments.
Hmm.
So just to raise people's awareness of the issues. And so with the Heatherwick Studio, we had a chance to do things in a little bit more systematic way.
Hmm.
We measured what's called fractal dimension of of the building sites. I thought I had another slide here. So fractal dimension is a mathematical measure. There are a number of different ways of trying to measure complexity. They are different when it comes to applying them to scenes like the ones that you see. They all come up with more or less the same kind of suggestion that the upper row of buildings here
Hmm.
has more complexity than the lower row of buildings. With fractal dimension, that comes out to differences in the numerical values for fractal dimension.
Hmm.
So at least we had something that was a little bit more systematic to base our analysis on.
Hmm.
We did, just as we did in the earlier work, we did some um, questionnaire type methods using these wonderful self-assessment mannequins that people can learn to use without exchanging words. So one of the problems sometimes in this field is that different words mean different things to different people. These
Hmm.
images have a lovely universality. I think everyone can understand the differences between the left pole and the right pole in these images, representing affect in the top row, arousal in the middle row, and dominance in the bottom row.
Hmm.
And the bar graphs just show the differences that we show between high and low complexity sites,
Hmm.
higher pleasure, higher arousal, and higher feelings of dominance.
Hmm.
Um, this was the skin conductance measure. We had people stand for longer. We had people stand for 5 minutes in front of these sites, which is has been slightly contentious because standing in front of a building and looking at it for 5 minutes is not a completely natural thing to do. But we wanted to make sure that whatever physiological signals we were getting had enough time to build. And so the the squiggly lines on the top part of the slide show, you can see the labels, hopefully, skin conductance level on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. When people stand in front of a higher complexity building, that value of skin conductance tends to go up over time. And when standing in front of a lower complexity building, it tends to go down over time.
And you did 5 minutes for each building.
For each building, yeah.
Yeah.
What you're looking at here is just a couple of typical examples. This is one person whose squiggles you're looking at in this diagram.
Hmm.
So we need, of course, to look at what happened overall. And this is the graph that shows the overall differences between high and low visual complexity in terms of its impact on people's nervous systems. So
Very
basically,
clear.
happily for us, we were able, under more careful conditions, to replicate those
Mm.
findings from 15 years ago, that there is an impact of facade design on skin conductance, which presumably has the other kinds of effects that we were just talking about.
Hmm.
Uh, so then, I mean, one of the questions that I like to think about is why, why does complexity have this profound effect on our physiology and
Mhm.
our emotional state? And there are a number of different ways to look at that. One of them is based on the work of an early, I guess you'd call him one of the founders of experimental aesthetics, Daniel Berline,
Mhm.
who worked for most of his career at the University of Toronto in Canada. And he basically made a biological argument that the drive to satisfy curiosity
Mhm.
is as strong as other kinds of drivers of behavior. So he was working in the context of a time when people thought about the motivators of behavior being things like thirst and hunger and the drive to have sex. And he said, the drive to satisfy curiosity, our thirst for information, is just as potent a driver of behavior as any of those things. And he described, you can see the U-shaped, the inverted U-shaped curve here. He described what he called the region of curiosity,
Mhm.
that there was an optimal level of complexity where people really um, were strongly attracted to the information giving potential of a site or a stimulus or whatever it was the case in that particular experiment.
Mhm.
And lower than that, we find the region of boredom, which we've clearly found in urban design. And beyond that is what Berline called the region of anxiety, where complexity outstrips our ability to process. So that's the biological argument.
Could
There's
you give
also,
an example where, sorry, complexity outstrips our ability to process it?
we've never, to be honest, we've never found a situation where complexity is high enough to do that. But my suspicion is that that is probably because of the sites that we've chosen. When I think of situations where the level of complexity might just be too high in an urban context, I think of maybe a very dense urban streetscape think of somewhere like Tokyo, for example. Think of, um, there were parts of, when we worked in Mumbai, there were parts of Mumbai that I would have thought, certainly for me, outstripped my ability to process. But
Mhm.
we didn't find it there, and I suspect it was because our participants in Mumbai were almost entirely local people. So we haven't had enough opportunity to study the responses of people who are um, unfamiliar with a complex urban context, perhaps to have found that region of anxiety. But
Well,
at any rate, we've never found it.
well, if you compare it to boredom and people, as you said, in places that have very, let's say, sterile environments. You even talked as far as drug abuse and substance abuse. There are some cities, I don't want to name and shame, but who have very, very little complexity. And they're known for no economic grandeur, to be polite about it. And I wonder if too much boredom causes all of that, then couldn't too much anxiety cause a lot of something else?
Yes, yes, it could. You're absolutely right. Um, all of that is plausible. I can only tell you that we have never found
Hmm.
complexity levels that are so high that preference values and skin conductance go in the opposite direction.
Would Times Square be, particularly with like all the moving, now that we have so many screens everywhere?
Maybe, yeah, that might be a good site to look. Although, of course, Times Square, I mean, it's um, a complex place of screens and lighting. but it's very different now that the cars have been removed.
Hmm.
I mean, I haven't been to Times Square now for some years, but my experience pre and post pedestrianizing Times Square, for as a first person experience, my experiences were quite different in the two cases.
And you mentioned Tokyo as an example. So I've been to Tokyo and I don't know how to separate the busyness because the people add to the anxiety. So if everybody's like rushing back and forth and then you've got a lot of complexity happening, that
Right.
definitely ups the ante. But if you were to do it at night or there's fewer people, it would be interesting to see if that complexity would be an issue.
Yeah, it would be for sure. And that might also be an example of a good situation where we might be able to use something like VR. I know for different purposes, we once modeled um Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, but we took all the people out. We in that case we were using it to because we wanted an example of an urban situation that was completely devoid of nature, not a plant, not a
Mm.
tree, not a blade of grass. Um, but certainly you could play with the impact of um, human density in a situation like that on people's processing complexity.
Okay, I won't bother you anymore. Just wanted to clear that up here.
Sure, no worries. Bother me as much as you like. There's no end to the experiments we could do. There's not enough time.
There's no end.
No, there isn't. Um, this is another. I mentioned Jane Jacobs before. Here she is again with a lovely image as well. There's another way of thinking about what complexity does to us.
Hmm.
I've called it here a metaphorical argument. Um, if you read the quote on this slide, I think I show this quote again later on, but um, she talks about the rich diversity of an environment as being kind of a signal. We can read that complexity as telling us things about how that neighborhood came to be. That, as she says,
Hmm.
it's the product of different periods of time, different aims, fashions. In other words, there's a complexity to the design of a neighborhood at a grassroots level. And her argument, I think, was that when we're in a complex, varied urban setting, that's what attracts us to it because we understand where it came from. We understand enough of its rich culture and history that it's the product of many hands, and that appeals to us. So it's a very different kind of argument to the bare biological argument that I showed you on the last
Well,
slide. But I think,
it's
go
very
ahead.
organic because if
Yeah,
you think about the way crops are grown naturally, that there's a plants, they don't just say, oh, we're going to be a monoculture over here. They are together, they're fused together, and they work better when different plants are growing in the same place. Some take care of insects and some don't. And one of the problems with monocultures is that you have just corn or just something else, and they're more susceptible to things. But the same way with food, when you have a plate that has different types of nutrients together, different types of colors, you've got a bit of the veggies, a bit of other things. And so this is in essence that the whole concept of diversity. Same thing with our genes. It's good to be mating with people from a different place of the world. So I think this is what this shows, like real life.
yeah, you're right, and that's a great analogy. That it's like the difference between industrial farming and permaculture.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
in terms of mating, it's like it makes me think of that. I haven't looked at its status recently, but that wonderful research that has to do with there's something called HLA subtype that we all have an HLA subtype. It's a genetic thing, and according to I'm trying to remember the name of the pioneering researcher who looked at this, but the argument was that we can detect the HLA subtypes of potential mates based on their smell.
The
There were these.
pheromones, is that what it's called?
No, I don't think it was pheromones. I mean, I suppose you could call it that. I remember these studies famously called the dirty t-shirt studies, where
Yes, yes.
remember those? Klaus Wedekind did this stuff. And when women were asked to smell the dirty
Sweaty
t-shirts,
men. Sweaty.
sweaty men, men with similar HLI subtypes, the women would say things like, "Oh, it smells like my dad. I'm not interested." And if they were unlike them, then they found that that's an interesting aroma. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I like this idea of, really generalizing our attraction to diversity in all kinds of different guises.
But it's also very poetic what she says. In
Yeah,
essence, she's saying that we are the product of all those who have come before us and the communities in which have been here and are here.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Absolutely right.
It's
Shall we go
beautiful.
on?
Yes.
This would be a great place to stop. I don't know how we're doing for time.
Yes, yes, we can stop here. You have to go in 9 minutes.
Okay,
So
well, my
this is
child
a
is, oh boy, I do.
so this is a good place to stop. I think I do want to bring that conversation we had before recording about. I know we talked about urban environments, but just because we talked about this before, let's go into the interiors for our last kind of discussion. Uh,
Okay.
you started the presentation with the impact of the hedgestones and how your dad's awe of them created a space for you to step into and admire that too, and kind of try to understand that. And you were also physically in the same space. And it is also an awe-inspiring moment. Um, there's so much to say about how our parents influence us and the way that we go about things. And so the headstone story for you, for me, it was my father bringing new technology into the house as something new and exciting. So any emerging tech to me has always been new and exciting. And so I wanted to talk about that from a complexity, emotions space. What do you think, if you think, what are your thoughts about how the interiors of our home growing up, what our parents have exposed us to, how that could potentially impact us?
That might take 9 minutes to tell you this story, but I want to tell you anyway. Uh,
Okay, go for it.
so I'm sitting in a house now. This is the longest that I've ever lived in a single house in my life. I've been here for 15 years.
Hmm.
And I've lived, academics move around a lot, so I've lived in something like I think 29 different homes in my life.
Hmm.
And when I first saw this house, when I was in the market, I needed to move. I found this listing. I called my realtor and she
Hmm.
said, "There's already an offer on this place." She said, "You'd have to go right now. You'd have to make a no conditions offer. You'd have to bid over asking price." And I said, "Well, I want to take a look." So I walked into the house and I think within 5 minutes I had decided this was my home. Like it was such a strong feeling of attachment to the home that I felt it was an intrusion that anybody else was even living there right now. And I said, "I'm going to make the offer." She said, "We don't know that you'll get a mortgage for this." I said, "I don't care. I'm going to make the offer and cross my fingers and hope for the best and no inspections and we'll go over asking and we'll beat this other offer." And things worked out. And I've known other circumstances in my life sometimes where you walk into someone's home and you feel at home there quickly. And other cases where you just ick, you don't want to be there for any longer than you have to be. And I didn't really understand any of that at all, except that not long after I moved here, I had another in a long succession of crazy ideas, which was that I wanted to, in an effort to, this was kind of like a midlife navel gazing kind of exercise. I wanted to understand who I was by exploring the history of my residences. So I decided to embark on, I guess you'd call it a pilgrimage, where I wanted to visit each of my homes in order, which I still haven't managed to do completely. But I started with my first two homes in England. And I lived in one of them until I was about 2.5 years old, and then we moved to another house where I lived until I was 7. That's when we came to Canada. And so I went to the first house. Actually, I went to the second house first. That's an irrelevant detail, but I went to the house that I remembered first. And I walked into the house. I had a number of surprises. One was that the people who owned the house were the people who had purchased the house from my parents.
Oh, wow.
They remembered me. I get a bit
Wow.
thinking about this, but they said, well, when we came to look at this house, you were playing football, as they would call it, soccer in North America, in the back garden. We saw you out there. The other kind of shock was that they said, we couldn't have afforded this house, but your parents lent us the down payment. They didn't know them. They just lent them this money. And then the relevant big shock was that I realized that the layout of that house was basically the same as the layout of the house where I live now. So I
Wow.
somehow remembered that. And even, the lady of the house then said, we kept some of the fixtures that like
Oh,
lighting that was here because we liked your mother's taste. And I felt as though there was this kind of
that's
resonance to
beautiful.
all of those early kinds of memories. And I mean,
Yeah.
it made me think, what else? Like, what other kinds of um, deep, unconscious
Yeah.
impacts? I mean, my parents, bless them, they've been gone for a long time now, but they still haunt me in every positive way. Like, what else did they do to me? Like, what other parts of me, other than, my appearance and things like that, do I owe to things to their influences? So
Well, if only we could ask a neuroscientist.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe we could find one.
So I think there's something there. Maybe you could add this to your long list of many things to look into.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I've the methodologies would be tricky. One of the other things, this is maybe a bit of a tangent and maybe a negative one. Oh, I can hear
It's time.
I'm being called by my 2-year-old upstairs. She's saying, "Daddy, where are you?"
All
So
right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I so appreciate it, and I look forward to staying in touch and what else you're going to be doing in the future.
great, thank you. This was a lot of fun for me.